Hi, I am going to be reviewing this logical reasoning question from Prep Test 75. And this is section 3 on Law Hub, and it's the second logical reasoning section if you're looking at a PDF or you have a hard copy of Prep Test 75. Okay, so first I'll look at the question stem. Which one of the following is most strongly supported by the statements made by the columnist? So most strongly supported, that's our question type, and we're using the statements made by the columnist. So we don't have an argument here where we're looking for a conclusion and premises. We have a series of statements and we're trying to find something that is supported by them. We might be able to make an inference, a logical deduction from the statements, which would be great. But we may just have to go with what is the best supported of the answer choices. So typically with this, we're going to be looking to kind of match the tone or the degree of certainty that we see in the statements. And we certainly don't want to go beyond that. Okay, and we don't want to bring in any information that we might happen to know or make any assumptions. So we want to be careful to stay within the boundaries of the statements being made. Okay, on average, about 70% of the profit from tourism in developing countries goes to foreign owners of tourist businesses. In general, as a country becomes a more established tourist destination, the proportion of revenues exported in this way increases. Okay. However, tourists can counteract this effect by obtaining accommodations and other services directly from local people. Okay. Okay, can counteract. All right. So let's see what the answer choices are here. A, tourists in a developing nation should. Okay. So should is stronger or different really than can, right? So can, it's possible to do this. Should is like a moral imperative potentially, right? Or a prescription of some kind. So I would be very wary of choosing an answer choice for a question like this that has the word should in it. That's fairly strong. And then it is conditional. So they're saying they should do it if most of the profits from tourism in that nation go to foreign owners of tourist businesses. Now, you might agree with that statement, right? Like you might think, well, very clearly it's a negative thing that foreign owners are profiting off of businesses in developing countries, and that you might agree that tourists should try to counteract that, but that's not something that's actually supported by the statements, right? There would be other reasons that we would have to give to support an imperative or a prescription like that. And so we may have our own reasons, moral reasons or ethical reasons or whatever, but that is not brought up at all in the statements. So we can't choose A. B, in at least some of the developing countries that are most established as tourist destinations, most of the profits from tourism go to foreign owners of tourist businesses. So yeah, I would certainly say that makes sense. On average, most of the profits go that way. And in general, as a country becomes more established as a tourist destination, that increases. So yeah, I mean, the word most here kind of gives me a bit of pause. I don't know how many countries would fall into that category of the ones that are the most established as tourist destinations, but that seems fairly reasonable given the first two statements. And something else to note is that we don't have to include all of the statements when we're coming to our conclusion here, right? Like this one really doesn't involve the third statement at all. I'm not super concerned about that. So that one I'm like, yeah, okay. I feel all right with it. If I see something that's better, I will eliminate it, but I'll leave it for now. C, in at least some developing countries, tourists obtain most of their accommodations and other services directly from local people. That we can't know, right? We do know that on average, that's not the case. Yeah, and it's possible that sometimes it's less than 70%, and yet it's still more than half, right? So I would actually have to eliminate this one. It's just not supported. D, in general, as a developing country becomes a more established tourist destination, local people become progressively poorer. So that also is not established or not supported. So progressively poor, we don't know that. We would say in general, as the country becomes more established, the proportion of revenues exported increases, but just because the proportion of revenues going to foreign businesses, foreign owners increases, that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual amount of money available to local people is going to go down. On the whole, it might actually go up. And at least it's possible that it could, right? All we know is the proportion going away tends to increase, but that's a percentage rather than the absolute amount. So that one is not supported either. E, tourists who obtain accommodations and other services directly from local people do not contribute in any way to the profits of foreign owners of tourist businesses. Again, not true, right? There are some services potentially that they could obtain from, foreign owners. I mean, do not contribute in any way is quite strong, right? So I think, yeah, looking at it as an all or nothing sort of scenario, like not supported, right? So tourists can counteract the effect of more than half of the money going to foreign owners, right? And even more than 70% going to foreign owners. But that doesn't mean that in doing so, they're actually ensuring that they do not buy anything that would somehow in some way, maybe even indirectly, contribute to the profits of foreign owners. So that one I would also eliminate. And I believe B is the strongest answer choice here. Okay, so let's double check. Okay, and B is correct. So hopefully my process and me articulating my process here is helpful to you. If you do have further questions about this one, please let me know. If there's some reason that you think that B is not the best answer out of this group, then please let me know. It's possible that B is not 100% correct. Like it's possible that there's an interpretation of B where we could say, well, that's not a pure deduction that we can make, right? So it is the correct answer because it's the best and the most strongly supported out of the statements available. But does that mean that it is like a pure, like unassailable deduction made from the statements? Not necessarily. It's just the best out of this group. And we do actually have a number of pretty bad answer choices in this group, like ones that are really just not supported at all, that bring up things that are irrelevant or that make some errors by assuming, for example, that proportion and absolute amount are going to be the same or going to coincide. That with should, right? That we can make a prescription just based on something that addresses like a possibility. So I think yeah, the other answer choices are clearly inferior here once we actually find the mismatches. So even though B might not jump out as like obviously supported, it's still the best out of the group. Okay. I'm also going to do question 25. All right. So this one is an argument-based stimulus, right? The argument depends on assuming. So that language depends on assuming means we're dealing with a necessary assumption question, also called a required assumption question, right? So a requirement, a necessary assumption, these are synonymous terms. The argument depends on this, it relies on this. This assumption is required for the argument to work. So good to kind of think about all the other ways maybe that this question might be asked and all the other words that would let you know I'm dealing with a necessary assumption question. Why is it important to identify that this is a necessary assumption question? Well, we're trying to distinguish it from the other assumption question, which is sufficient assumption. So for a necessary assumption question, we're looking for something without which the argument would fail. So if we don't have this, the argument will fail. Just because we have this assumption doesn't necessarily guarantee that the conclusion is going to be correct. Okay, but if we don't have it, then we're going to have problems. So to test which answer choice is correct, we may want to apply the negation test. Okay, and I have discussed this probably a couple times before in previous videos, but to go over it briefly again, the negation test involves negating the answer choice and asking what impact that has on the argument. If we negate the answer choice and it's necessary for the argument, negating it will ruin the argument, right? If we take away something that's required, then we're not going to be able to get to the end result, the end goal, in this case, the conclusion, okay? So if we go through the answer choices and negate them and use that process, if we negate something and it doesn't really have an impact on the argument, you know, the conclusion could still be reached even if this thing wasn't true, then we know that that thing isn't necessary and we can eliminate it. If we negate it and we realize that negating it would ruin the argument, then we know that thing is necessary and we've found the correct answer. So yeah, so just keep that in mind, and also note that we cannot use the negation test when we're dealing with a sufficient assumption question. Okay. The populations of certain species of amphibians have declined dramatically in recent years, an effect many scientists attribute to industrial pollution. Okay, so this actually does follow a pattern that we see in a lot of arguments where we kind of have them start out by saying, oh, well, some people say, or some people believe, some people think X, but I think Y, or the evidence points to that not being the case, or that argument is flawed in some way. So starting out by saying some people think X, and then in contrast, I think Y, or I think not X. Okay, so I'm seeing we may be dealing with that kind of structure here because they say many scientists attribute it to this, and then I see the word however. Okay. All right, so the populations of certain species of amphibians have declined dramatically in recent years, an effect many scientists attribute to industrial pollution. However, most amphibian species populations, all right, most amphibian species populations, and here they say populations of certain species of amphibians. So I would really be paying special attention to those modifying words, right? Certain species versus most species. Certain species could fall into like a tiny minority out of all amphibian species, and most amphibian species could be just barely over 50%, right? So there's actually a lot of room where those certain species may not fall into the category of the majority. Okay, so I'm already being critical of this argument because I know that there's an assumption that this argument is depending on, right? And so an assumption is something that they haven't supported, and they maybe even haven't um, uh, thought of, right? Like it might be something they've completely failed to consider, but that is relevant to their argument, right? So there's like this gap or this hole in the argument, and I'm already trying to find that as I start reading. So noticing a mismatch in these modifying words is pretty key. Okay. However, most amphibian species populations vary greatly from year to year because of natural variations in weather, right? So the scientists have attributed it to industrial pollution. And here they're saying most vary because of natural reasons. It is therefore impossible to be sure that the recent decline in those amphibian populations is due to industrial pollution. All right, impossible to be sure. Why? Because it very well could be natural variations. Okay, that depends on assuming that these certain species of amphibians, their populations vary greatly year to year because of natural variations, right? So if we know that those populations do not vary year to year naturally, and that their dramatic decline cannot be explained by natural variations, then it may be possible to attribute it to industrial pollution. And we certainly can't use this premise here to conclude that it's impossible, right? So there is definitely a gap there, and the gap is between certain species and most species. Okay, so we would have to fill that gap by saying that those certain species fall into the majority. Okay. All right. A, the amphibian species whose population declines have been attributed by many scientists to industrial pollution are not known to be among those species whose populations do not vary greatly as a result of natural variations in the weather. So what if we negate this? To negate it, I'm actually going to just remove not, right? So what if this isn't true? What if in fact these species are known to be among species whose populations do not vary as a result of natural variations? Okay, what if we know that they don't? Well, then it may actually be possible to be sure that the recent decline is due to industrial pollution. Maybe, right? Then maybe we can get to the conclusion. We're not necessarily guaranteed to get to the conclusion. Or sorry, sorry, it may be possible then, right? So then we can't get to the conclusion. I got myself a little bit mixed up there. If we negate A and we know that they don't vary with the weather, right? Then we know those certain species do not belong to the majority, right? And so then we actually have disconnected those premises, right? We've disconnected that premise from the conclusion that the idea that most of them vary like this means that it's impossible to know that it would be industrial pollution. So yeah, A is getting at that idea that not all, it's possible not all amphibian species populations do vary like that. And so maybe these certain species who have declined don't vary in that way. So the fact that there are some that vary according to the weather doesn't actually have any impact on whether or not we can attribute the decline in this population to industrial pollution. So A, if it's not true, would really ruin our argument here. So A passes the negation test. Okay. So based on that, I would choose A. And I don't even really need to get into the other answer choices there. Okay. I certainly can. So let me know if you do want me to go over any of the other answer choices and explain why, when I negate them, it doesn't ruin the argument, and why, it's not necessary that that thing is exactly true. Um, okay. All right. I will leave it there for now. And, as you could tell by, me kind of making that mistake, the sort of negating negatives and trying to keep in mind what you're doing when you're performing the negation test is kind of complicated. It's sort of hard to do it in your head. I often, if I'm doing something like this, I actually do have like little notes that I'll write down. I'm not taking notes at the moment. I'm just doing, audio, right? So trying to kind of focus on that. But um, yeah, it may be worthwhile to actually use some scrap paper for these types of questions and doing the negation test. Um, yeah, it's also something that's worth practicing on its own, doing a lot of necessary assumption questions. Just identifying those questions with the words depends, relies on, necessary, required, requires. Those are the words that you're going to see pop up in the question stem for a necessary assumption question. Okay, great. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.